Hey, it's Betsy here. And if you've been feeling worn down chasing clients, drained by the uncertainty, restless for more influence and impact, now is the moment to turn it around. Truth is, there are clients out there who need you more than ever, and not just for tactics, but to help them navigate the complexity of today's economic and political environment because they still have things that they want to achieve and they need your help achieving them. They need you to step up, make it easy for them to find you, see your value, and understand that investing in you now is exactly what they need. And that's exactly what I'm going to show you inside my Impact and Income Accelerator. This is my brand new 8-week group coaching program where I'm going to show you step by step on how to master my proven partnership setup approach to landing strategic client engagements, where you're going to be positioned as a trusted partner and influential guide. You'll get everything that you need: live training, ready to use scripts, templates, and tools, personalized coaching from me to craft proposals and partnership agreements that get you high paying strategic work that your clients will be saying yes to. So, if you're ready to earn more and influence more and actually work less, even in today's uncertain economy, this program is for you. So, registration and early bird pricing is now open for the October 2025 cohort. So, head on over to my website at www.betsygordan.com/accelerator. The link's in the show notes. I hope to see you inside the program. And so, now onto the show. Well, hey there, and welcome to the Consulting Matters podcast, where we dive into all kinds of issues, little and big, about what it takes to grow a thriving, purpose driven consulting or coaching business. I'm your host, Betsy Jordan, and I'm a business mentor and a brand positioning and messaging strategist. You can find out all about my programs on my website at www.betsyjordan.com. And don't forget, Jordan is with a Y, not an A. There's some other Betsy Jordan out there who's getting all my emails and visitors to the website. So let's get into today's episode. I'm usually up for a good debate. I think debates are awesome. They're a great way to stretch your thinking and come up with new ideas. But one debate I'm not a huge fan of is when we're trying to parse out the differences between consultants and coaches and framing up those differences as simply this. Consultants tell and coaches ask. And the reason why I'm not a huge fan of it is I don't think this is the right frame, because I don't think the core of what we do as both consultants and coaches is simply about the advice we give or even about the questions we ask, but it's really connected to how well we listen. And today we're going to get beyond trying to figure out, like, what are the right questions to ask our clients in a discovery meeting or stakeholder assessments or in our coaching. And we're going to dive into what really matters in those circumstances, which is our ability to listen. To help us with this, I'm bringing on the show Dr. Rick Bommelje, who spent the past 25 years helping leaders become more successful through the power of listening. So he's the founder of the Leadership and Listening Institute. He's the author of 3 books on this very important topic. And most importantly to me, he was my professor at Rollins when I was in graduate school learning how to become an organization development consultant. And he was my first mentor. So I talk about Dr. Bommelje all the time because he was the one who helped me first discover the importance of strategic positioning that led to the career that I have now. So I am so excited to have him on the show. It's an opportunity for me to offer tribute to the impact that he's had on my career and also to give you a glimpse into how he came to this particular advice that really changed the trajectory of my career and how I help my clients right now. So I'm really excited to get into both aspects around how do you navigate the complexity of getting your seat at the table and how to use your listening skills as a way to make the impact that you want to have once you arrive. So without further ado, welcome to the show, Rick. I normally would call you Dr. Bommelje because of our past relationship, but welcome, welcome. I'm so thrilled to have you here.
Thank you. I'm so delighted to be with you.
I really don't think I can get into all the questions I want to ask you about the importance of listening and how that is really a key skill for consultants and coaches and leaders all to have without acknowledging who you are and what you've meant to my career. So I want to tell you, I don't know if you remember this experience or I remember it, because it was so transformational for me. But I had just graduated from the Rollins program. And the last thing I did in my graduate program, my last class was having you as my mentor. And I had the official title as an organization development consultant within my nonprofit organization, and they had just announced this big org design project, and I wasn't leading it. I thought, like, I at least I was gonna be leading it, and I wasn't on the team. And I remember how you coached me through that process, and what you had told me back then is you told me no one's gonna use my expertise, like, exactly the way that I want. I don't know if I'm paraphrasing, but this is the gist I got out of it, is no one's gonna use my expertise necessarily the way that I want. It's up to me to position myself for the work that I wanted and
Mm.
the role that I wanted. So, with that advice, what I did is I don't know if you remember this, like, coaching, because 'cause I'm sure you've mentored, like, hundreds of people since then, but I went to the VP in charge of that particular project based on your advice, and you told me, "Just offer my availability. I'm a student, just to be there, just to learn, I'll just be a fly on the wall." And he's like, "Great," and he put me on the team. Not even he didn't put me on the team, he just put me as an observer on the team. And then you told me to make myself indispensable to the external consultant who was there. And then I went and offered my availability, "What do you need to do?" And so he was in Atlanta and the team was in Orlando. So I'd go and facilitate different things, on his behalf, and then he started, like, delegating more and more of the project, and by the end of the project, I was leading the whole thing. He was done. I was in charge of leading that whole initiative. I got all this recognition from that. And that's what changed the game for me in my consulting career, is I never waited around to get invited to the table. I always
Wow.
knew I had to get in there so that when I left that nonprofit and I went to Disney, I took the accountability. Like, I'm gonna go break in is the way I looked at it, is not marketing. It's like, I'm gonna break into my client system. I'm going to, find the way in, offer my availability. And then I continued on. And then when I started my own business, it just that became like a different kind of marketing. It's not like I'm breaking into a client system. I had to break into a market, and I had to do that. And I continue on and it influenced everything that I have right now because of that moment. I don't know if you remember
Incredible.
it as clearly. Obviously, I was the mentee, so it meant more, or maybe it was more vivid for me, but that's that's the impact that you had. You completely transformed my career. Everything I do as a positioning person was based on that one piece of nugget that you taught me, and I've
Wow.
helped tons of clients because of that perspective on taking charge of the positioning. Like, I'm getting emotional. I'm so grateful that you're here.
Wow. And as you described that, Betsy, I need that today. I need the wisdom that you have gained through your experiences. I need to hear that. I need to deeply listen to that today.
Wow. So, before I go on with the rest of the interview, sorry, I just wanted to let you know you've meant so much to me.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm just awestruck by the whole dynamic of this.
Sorry. Sorry, listeners. Uh, you get this is not the way podcast
Eh,
interviews are supposed to go.
This is the real deal.
Um, because it's not every day that you get to give tribute to somebody, and so thank you for that. What I would like to do, though, is draw out a little bit more of the transferable principles to other people. Like, all these years, I've been wondering, what was behind that perspective of what created this career changing advice that I have from you? What is that like just something in the moment that came up in our conversation, or is that a perspective that you had that you typically use with the mentees like I was at the time?
Wow, what a great question. And as I'm thinking back, that was in the 97, 98 period. Was that
Yes, it
correct?
was like, 90, yeah, no, like 90 I was in the inaugural MHR class, and I think our mentorship was in 99.
Okay.
Oh, no,
So
no,
my
it
jour
wasn't in 99, it was 98, you're right. It was 98. No,
oh,
no, no, no.
okay.
It was 97. You were correct in the first place. 99 is when I went to Disney. You're right, it was 97.
Okay. Well, what was happening in my professional life at that time is that I had been at Rollins for over 2 decades, um, in an administrative role. and I had been drawn to professional development. Um, I was the through a number of I started in an entry level position at Rollins after graduating with my bachelor's degree from there, and got into continuing education. And I was the assistant to the dean. I was his helper. He was ex-military, as was I. He was a um, just a war hero, a colonel, an amazing person, and he needed a helper. And so I was able to come to join Rollins, and from that point forward, had tremendous growth opportunities under his wing. And eventually he retired, and I was really at a transition point because there were lots of things happening internally from a shift of administration, philosophy, vision, mission, all that. And our vibrant continuing education program was being shrunk to be able to move in a different direction. And so I was at a crossing point and I decided to create an idea. It was to form a new unit within the college that had never been before, not relating to a formal degree. Anything that was education oriented. And in my mind, my interest was management, leadership, not listening at the time. And all of a sudden they said, okay, well, that sounds harmless. Go ahead and do it. And over a period of, gee whiz, over a decade, we grew from myself and one other person to a team of 12. And so at that point, when we connected, I had a number of different learning experiences through this venture, and I guided the unit, especially into professional development, where we were doing all kinds of workshops and seminars, and I started to do external coaching, and it was really a fascinating experience. And at the same time, I had continued on my academic journey, going and receiving the master's from Crummer and postmaster's degree in educational administration, then went to UCF, got my degree in educational leadership. But always with the idea of thinking about, well, what can I do to be able to serve other leaders and serve myself too in this role? Always learning, always teaching is one of my philosophies. And I learn so much more from what people learn from me, right? And so at that point, I was invited to consider coming in as a visiting professor, to leave my role as an administrator, come in as a visiting professor. Now, a visiting professor means 6 years maximum and you're out. And and I had over 20 years with the college, and so this was a real risk point for me. I talked this over with my wife. I wanted to develop a business, and as I'm learning more about your business, Betsy, I want to be like you, at that point. And Quinn, my wife, said, "Well, go ahead, go for it. 6 years, you'll be able to teach and you can grow your business." And so a year and a half into it, I was approached by the provost saying, "Hey, we have an opportunity here that I think you could fit perfectly in, where there's a tenure track position open up." And what that means is if you go through all the gates and you publish and you do all that stuff and you gain tenure, it's essentially lifetime employment. And again, I went back to Quinn and I said, "Well, what do you think?" Because there's limitations too to this. And she said, well, stability. And so we went in that journey. But at that time when we connected, that's when I was in this transition point of this new beginning role as a visiting professor and making that shift from an administrator to a brand new journey where I took a hefty cut in pay to be able to pursue this in my dream of building the business, right? That's what the real goal was. So that's where that, as you echo, I was really telling myself too.
Mm. So
And I'm
so you weren't a
so delighted.
full-time professor as part of the MHR program, you were a visiting professor as part of our program?
Exactly.
Okay, nobody would
I
have
was a
known. You seem like the
yes,
heart of my program.
yes, yes. I was a part-time, they call them adjunct instructors. Yes.
Had no idea. I thought you were like core creator of like when I think about my masters, I don't really think about the HR side as much as the OD side. And you taught the OD class and you're
Yeah.
my mentor at the end. I never would have imagined the way that you were showing up that it wasn't like a big part of your brainchild to create this program.
Yeah, absolutely not. In fact, that program was created by Don Rogers, who was at the time a full tenured professor. But the uniqueness of the program is that just about everyone else was an adjunct. So all of your professors, with the exception of Don and maybe Bob Smither was involved in that at the time, I'm not sure. Most of them were adjunct professors.
I think I had a choice to take a class with him or you, and I picked you. I think you guys are both
Yes.
so I wound up in your class. That is so interesting. So it seems like where the advice that you were giving me was coming out of the situation that you're at, and I think that that is an interesting insight that sometimes, as we're in this learning mode, like, sometimes we teach what we are in the middle of learning all at the same time, so the advice you gave me came out of your own understanding of, like, I have to really kinda create the opportunities that you wanted and that they like, it's almost like they're just not gonna plop on your lap, like, you have to create them.
Exactly. Exactly. And as I sit in my trajectory today, I need to do that again because I'm not full time employed at Rollins now. I don't call it retire, I call it I've shifted. And to be able to now, and I feel that as far as the game, I'm at the top of my game in terms of all I've gained. And I still have this voracious appetite to learn more and more and more, and to be able to pass it on to other folks as well. Because I've had so many of these experiences that are quite different from most. But what propelled me initially into the listening world were mistakes, mine. I almost lost my job because I was not listening. And I almost lost my marriage, not once, but multiple times for the same reason. And that awakening that I was a lousy listener propelled me into a search. And I couldn't find a course, I couldn't find a mentor like you were mentioning, but I found an organization, the International Listening Association. And I connected with one person who was the founder of the organization, Dr. Manny Style, and he introduced listening into corporate America in the late 1970s.
Huh.
He also was a full professor at University of Minnesota and studied with the father of the field of listening, Dr. Ralph Nichols. They were partners. and I learned from him. He became my coach, my mentor. Everything he had, I needed. And that's how I started. And so the first maybe year and a half, I was just learn and apply in all these different areas, not even thinking about teaching. And then after a considerable period of time and maybe a year and a half, in a 1 day workshop, I included 15 minutes on listening, just some basics. And folks came up to me and they said, "Do you have any more of this?" I said, "Yeah." So the 15 minutes went to 30 minutes in a 8-hour program, leadership program. And I was doing that. And then I got a call from the chair of the communication department at Rollins who said, "Hey, Rick, I hear you just doing some stuff on listening. How would you like to create a course for us? We've never done anything on listening." And I'm thinking, well, I'm good for 30 minutes. How am I going to fill 40 hours? Right. But I figured the call was coming in for a reason. I said, I'll do it. And that started the journey. And
I wanna get into all of the listening part. Can we put a
yes,
bow on the positioning part? Because I think that this leads into the next part. Is it sounds like so that sounds like the advice that you gave me came out of your own personal experience, but it seems like
of
there's,
course.
like, different threads that go along with, like, taking responsibility for the positioning, is there's a little bit of learning and a little bit of entrepreneurship. Is that there seems like there's, like, learn and apply, like, I just wanna, like, I have something to offer, but I have something to learn, but at the same time, like, I have to kinda be entrepreneurial about my work. That I have to kinda have that mindset, like, I have to create opportunity and then respond to the opportunities. It feels like even as you moved from the different phases, like, when you moved into the listening part, it's like, I need to learn more about this for myself, like, so there's a personal component, and then it was, like, proactively kind of putting some stuff out there to see what happens and then let people respond, and then the response came, is it went from, this short 30 minutes into a 40-hour type of program, and now you have the opportunity in front of you to create something new.
Exactly. Exactly. And it wasn't, I didn't have this grand vision of connecting the dots of listening leadership until many years later. It was quite frankly, okay, I've got this course now. And I figured in the beginning it was going to be a small group. Rollins has small class sizes. The first, and it's going to be for adults. So I'm thinking, well, we're going to have 12 students, and we had 40.
Wow.
And there was a waiting list, and there was no empty seats. And they came to hear from the master, and I had 30 minutes and a textbook. And I told them, don't read ahead because I was literally one chapter ahead of them each week. But at the end of that, Betsy, what I really learned that has sustained to this day is that if you want to learn it, you teach it because your fellow learners will teach you in the process with their questions, their challenges, their insights, their perspectives. And so it was a full circle process. And it was just, okay, well, let's keep going. All of a sudden it bloomed.
So let's get into listening. Now let's get into the subject area a little bit more. So, and let's make sure we're all on the same page around what does it mean to really listen? Like, I think some people might say, I hear something, but I think that there's a difference in the definition of hearing versus listening. Like, what does
Absolutely.
it mean to listen? And what do most of us not get about what listening really is?
Well, there are a number of basics, and the rock solid foundation is the definition of how you view listening. And so I'm standing on the shoulders of giants. And my mentor, Dr. Stile, had created this definition of listening that it's a complex, it's a natural, um, but it's also a learned human behavior of doing five things: sensing, That means taking in the message, not just with your ears, but with all 5 senses. Hear it, see it, taste, touch, smell. Interpreting, understanding what you're taking in, asking questions, encouraging people, all that. Then you've earned the right to go to the evaluating stage. You can make a judgment because you understand very succinctly what's happening. Then you respond. Now, in this definition of listening, there is a responding piece, verbally or non verbally. And the last stage is the memory piece, or remembering what's of value that you can use going forward. So we take the definition and we take those 5 components and we have a new word. And the new word is SIER with the asterisk at the end, seer.
I wanna take notes, like, it's like I feel like
Yeah.
I'm in class, and it's like I wanna take notes, like, no, I'm doing a podcast right now because I wanna be able to remember all of these, so it's like, okay, I'm, like, paying attention, there's sensing, there's the response, there's the valuation, I forgot what the things are in the middle, so yay, we got an acronym, so it's SIER.
R. And I put an asterisk at the end to signify memory. And that asterisk could also be the golden pause, as I put it, or mindful silence.
So what's the I again?
The I is interpreting.
Okay, so we go from sensing to interpreting to evaluating to responding to mindfulness and, memory of some type.
Right. And this happens in a nanosecond. We're doing it in this podcast.
Could you provide examples of, like, how are we doing this in this podcast?
Well, I'm sensing your words, and I'm also have the opportunity to sense your nonverbals. And as you share a message with me, I'm understanding what you're saying, and you have the ability to articulate very clearly your message. So I'm not having to ask you a lot of questions for clarification. But then I go to the E stage, the evaluating stage, and I start asking myself questions here, right? How credible is the person that's sending the message? What about the evidence here?
Huh.
And I'm learning about all this evidence that you have in your career trajectory about how you've succeeded. And then the responding piece is what I'm saying or showing back to you. And I'm remembering what you're saying in the process. So that's if over the last almost 40 years now of being able to immerse myself in this, some folks have asked me, well, what's the most important thing of all of it? Just give me this is it. Seer. If you know it, and you do it and you be it, all of a sudden, it's a game changer.
So I'm getting an image in my head of your definition. So that seems like what's the difference between, like, hearing and listening, and I picture, like, a couple people, like, throwing balls at each other, like they're playing catch back and forth. And, like, hearing might be is, like, I see the ball and it, like, comes my way and it kinda plops in front of me, but it seems like listening is I catch the ball, I receive the ball, and I experience the ball before I throw the ball back.
100%. That's a wonderful metaphor. And I'll give you another example of how we can take this and to a new level. It's from hearing to searing, right? Because too many people equate listening with hearing, and it minimizes it.
Mhm,
Another dimension is the word active. We hear the word active listening. It's such a buzzword.
mhm.
It's redundant. Why don't we say active speaking, active writing, active reading, right? Active listening comes from Carl Rogers back in the 1960s in the whole realm of therapeutic listening. He wrote the book, Active Listening. Some folks along the way have grabbed hold of that and taken the concept of active listening and have said, well, I'm going to give you eye contact and I'm going to nod. I'm going to say some
Mhm.
verbal prompts
Yes, uh-huh, Dr.
and you
Bommelje. I
could
mean,
be
Rick, I
miles
mhm,
away
mhm.
and you could be miles away, right? And so you know when someone is deeply listening to you because you can feel it. There is an energy exchange. There is a vibration, and that's through the power of Seer.
I love that because it's like you're really connecting with the person that you're with. Like it's almost like we are going into like a unique kind of space together. Like there's a container for a real meaningful exchange rather than I'm going to play act these different behaviors that make it seem like I'm really listening, but I'm not. Which goes to why this is super important. So I work with consultants and coaches and they are very worried about figuring out what the right questions are and, like, what are the questions I should ask in a discovery meeting? What are the questions I should ask, like, in an assessment or a stakeholder type of thing? And I always would tell them, like, it doesn't really matter what your questions are. It matters what your listen fors are. Like, the listen fors are what matters. Can you elaborate on the rationale for that advice? Like, why is this a really important skill set for consultants and coaches to have that I think makes or breaks their role as a consultant and their effectiveness?
Without a doubt, and it crosses over into sales. It crosses over into every single field. In my view, listening is the ultimate leadership competency. The ultimate leadership competency. And if we're not fully knowledgeable of why we listen, how we listen, when we miss the golden opportunities. And for a coach or a consultant, that's your whole job.
Mhm.
I always had oh it- kind of in my mind a timer that in my coaching sessions it's a 90-10 split. 90% them, 10% me in terms of speaking. I'm at the 90% level throughout, searing. And when I come in, most of the 10% is not going to be fixing, saving, advising, or correcting. Most of my 10% is going to be asking honest, inviting questions.
It's interesting because I did this survey with a bunch of my former executive clients when I was pivoting and to the work I do now, and I was asking 'em, like, "Why do you hire consultants?" And one of these leaders who leveraged me all the time, like, "What was it about it?" And he's like, "Because you could get into my head and organize my ideas and help me see things that I'm thinking clearer than I was realizing." I'm like, "But, what about my masters or what about my time at Disney?" He's like, "I don't care about any of that." He's like, "I could care about how I asked questions, like, but not on the surface level, like, I kept probing and, like, pulling ideas out of his head and then, like, organizing it, and then he really liked that I did that sometimes with groups, like, with executive teams, like, listen to everybody and then, like, found the through line. So there was, like, a lot of questions and questions and questions, but then there was, like, that moment where you're almost, like, doing that mirroring back to them, like, "No, this is what I think I'm hearing you say," and then they're like, "Ah, yes, it's exactly what I was thinking," and then it's like all this relief just washes over them. And I think there's something about, like, people, like, really having a deep, deep need as a human level, like, I wanna be seen and I wanna be heard, and when somebody can mirror back what I'm saying, then it's like then they're golden, like, they're credible, they mean something to me, they care about me because they mirrored me accurately.
100%. 100%. I had, he's now a dear friend. One of my early clients was an attorney, a managing partner in a law firm, and he came because there was instability in his law firm, and within, I would say, max maybe 3 to 4 months, he had all that cleared up. Our relationship, went on for 4 years,
Wow.
and he it was weekly, and I would say to him, "Armando, time for you to leave." And he'd say, "No, no, no, I wanna go a little bit further." And finally I said, "What value are you getting from this?" He says, "I need the questions."
Mm.
And it was the accountability questions, because he wasn't getting that anywhere else. And I learned so much from him in this process, and the power of questions. Because in my mind, that's what a coach or consultant gets paid to do, is ask these compelling questions,
And
and you feel those.
like, ask the questions and draw out the answers. Like, it's not enough to ask the right questions. Like, I can give you a question bank, like, what's the point of a question bank? And I think there's a
Well,
wasted debate that people have around, like, "Oh, what's the difference between consultants and coaches?" Like, coaches ask and consultants tell. I'm like, well, what's the point? Like, you could tell, like, that they're both all part of the same. Why, I don't know why we're parsing it out, because it still feels like ultimately at the end of the day, it's about listening and help asking deep questions, not the surfacey level questions. Like, you can go to ChatGPT and get some questions that are interesting, but nobody's listening to them. Like, I think there's something about the relationship. I think that there's something on a limbic level. Like, it's not just about the questions, it's the questions and the witness of the relationship.
yes, it's the space that happens. Viktor Frankl, that incredible, psychiatrist that was in the Holocaust and Man's Search for Meaning, his wonderful book, he talks about this space, uh, where there is a point in a conversation or a communication, there's this space where he calls it the opportunity for growth and freedom.
Mm.
But that happens through the power of silence. I call it the golden pause. And so it's not, in my mind, about having this list of questions. Throw the questions out. The questions will emerge if you're deeply searing the person.
Yes. Say that again, because I
That's
think this is
why,
quotable. The questions
that's
will
why,
emerge. Continue.
yes, that's why I believe we're listening leaders. And I'm viewing leadership through the lens of adaptive leadership in the work of Dr. Ron Heifetz at Harvard, where it's not about position, title, authority, any of that. It's about tackling these tough challenges of life, called adaptive challenges, that many, if not most, clients come to coaches and consultants for the answer. They're facing an adaptive challenge. Our role is to come alongside of them and to help them on this journey. And we don't have to be subject matter experts. We just have to be listening leaders.
What's an adaptive challenge? Can you put more words around that? I think that's really powerful,
Uh,
because that does seem like a lot of my clients are struggling with, like, what do consultants do? What's the value that coaches bring? What's the market need? And it sounds like you're really just framing that out. Like, what is an adaptive challenge? And then we could talk easily about what the value and the value add a consultant can coach can bring to an adaptive challenge.
exactly. An adaptive challenge is something, we'll contrast it with a technical problem. A technical problem, there's uncertainty. You're facing uncertainty, and other people have faced it too, but it's been systematized in a rule, a guideline, a procedure. You follow the steps, Happens all the time with technology. Follow the steps, just as we were trying to get the echo out of the voice, right? Follow the steps and solved. Uncertainty with a short time frame, but with an adaptive challenge, new territory. Haven't faced this one before. I have to figure it out, find a way, make something happen. And that becomes the true spirit of leadership. I view it as a leadership, ship on a stormy sea, not a calm harbor. So we're on the stormy sea and the clients are on the stormy sea and we're on the boat with them and we're helping them. We're serving them through the power of listening.
I think this is why what you're saying makes me realize, like, why I always use the heroic journey, the Joseph Campbell, myth structure to describe the role and purpose of consultants and coaches is your clients are the hero and they're about or heroine, and they're about to go into the unknown world, like, or they're in a step change, something different, and every hero or heroine has a mentor. Like, every single one of them, because there's all this unknown, all this uncertainty, like Marshall Goldsmith says, like, "What got you here won't get you there." But and trust what got you here, and everything else is a big unknown. So therefore, this is when you bring in a real consultant or coach, not somebody who's just there to do work for the organization, but people who are going to guide them to what your colleague was describing as adaptive challenge. It seems just like they're in some sort of transformation space. They're in the liminal space and they need somebody to come alongside because it's so confusing and it's so all like to me, it's like a full body. Like when you go through transformations, like it's full body. I mean, the butterfly sounds lovely, like hop into a cocoon and, caterpillar hops into a cocoon and, flies off later on, but it's like but inside the cocoon, the butterfly the caterpillar literally digests itself of everything that's not the butterfly. That's a pretty violent process. Like, that sounds like really difficult. Why would you wanna do that alone, when you can have somebody who helps guide you through that type of adaptive challenge?
Yes, I call it the work, the work of leadership.
Yeah. And it is that
And
is the work part that gets hard. It's not easy, it's difficult.
and everybody is a practicer of leadership. And I say everybody because what's the work? It's called life. And if you're not facing adaptive challenges on the job, you certainly are when you're off the
That's
job.
for sure. Especially nowadays, like, there's lots of adaptive challenges that we're all facing. Can you paint me a
Yes,
picture of a consultant or coach who has, like, greater mastery in these listening skills versus one who's just okay with it? Or, like, I don't wanna necessarily we don't need to paint a picture, I think, of horrible listeners because I don't think anybody would choose consulting or coaching if they're just abysmal with listening, but just kind of like, okay, like, they're so-so, but they're not as good as they could be.
I think it's a person that has an open mind, they have an open heart, they are extremely curious, and they have a strong stomach
What does that mean? Like, why do they need a strong stomach?
because they're into the unknown with their clients.
Mm,
And you can only show up, in my opinion, for who you are, what you can bring. It's not about impress, it's about impact. And you want to try to deeply, and I always come back to this, deeply sear what their need is. And if we don't have a clear understanding of that need, I've had some clients where I just say, I think that there's probably a better matched person for you than me. And maybe the crass term is you fire the client, but I realize that and I see it in the classroom too. I can't fire students. I would like to
uh-huh.
because their mindset's not there. And so it's being in sync, trying to be in continuous sync, My wife is, world champion, US champion ballroom dancer, was on America's Got Talent. They won the Golden Buzzer. She started dancing at age 60. I mean, never having danced before, went on America's Got Talent at age 70, and her and her partner won the Golden Buzzer. We're on the Dolby Theater. And I say this because as I've learned now as an observer more about what she's doing, coaches and clients are in the dance.
Mm,
And
beautiful
you've
analogy.
got to be in step with your client, not step on their toes.
Well, I got 2 things in response to that. One is I wanna meet Quinn because I wanna learn ballroom dancing, and I'm at the older age. I'm not quite 60 yet, but I'm a few years from that, so I wanna meet her, so maybe afterward you can get me contact information.
Yes.
But second, if we're supposed to be in this dance with our clients, and we're supposed to have this relationship, but we're in this crazy AI world, tons of technology, social media, like how does technology affect our ability to develop that type of dance, that fluidity with a client when they think that they can just go to ChatGPT and get the same quality advice, that they can just do a Google search and, like, how does technology fit into this priority of listening?
Wow, this is really timely because I've just started a newsletter on LinkedIn, The Listening Leader. My idea was I've been out of full-time employment at Rollins now for 2 years, but I still want to contribute, right? Yet my client base that I previously have, they're on to their next step in the life's journey. So I'm at a point where it's like new consultant, right? And so I'm thinking, okay, well, what can I do to be able to go beyond just a post on LinkedIn? I'm going to go ahead and create this weekly newsletter. Have no idea what it's going to do, but I want to just share what's on my mind. And so I think that it was maybe in one of my first posts, I did something about AI and listening and talked about what the robot can't do. But now, in fact, I'm preparing for the next week right now. What can the robot do to pair with searing? And there are so many things that I'm learning that it can do that I could never do. And it around technology in terms of gathering data and sending survey and analyzing trends with speech patterns and all that stuff. And it can do that really, really fast and give me necessary information. That's the I in Seer, right? And if it fits with the E, evaluating, if it fits this, then I can respond appropriately and serve even better. So where I'm thinking, I know very little about AI, and I'm trying to become a voracious student. But what comes up for me, Betsy, is that if we don't, we are going to be left behind because other coaches and consultants are going to know how to be able to, it's not either or, it's both and, bring them both together to be able to optimize a client relationship.
And I think it's like the low value tasks are the things that ChatGPT can do or AI can do for you. Like if you're talking about things like, okay, so I have a data set. Now I did qualitative research and I need to flag each one of these things and theme them. Like you could have a research assistant go through and just like theme it, but it's like making meaning out of it. That's what you do. But I still think that, like, when consultants and coaches are worried that they're gonna lose their jobs, we're gonna lose our relevance. I'm like, but the whole point of transformation in that book, called The General Theory of Love, talks about, like, how do people change, and it's in the context of, the limbic revision regulation. It's like that it's through the relationship, and I think that that's the part that I get worried about is ChatGPT is not like the collective unconscious, it's a data scraper from what's in the existing. It's not like the universe that's got, like, some sort of unique message that's there to deliver something to you, and I think it's really easy, to fall into that trap, and, the way the program sets up, it looks like it's listening. That's a great idea, here's exactly what you said, and it's like, "That's not what I said," like, I think ChatGPT, you're gaslighting me a little bit, but that's not what it's designed to do. Like, you have to ignore all of that kinda stuff and let it be its junior person, but I still think, like, at a human level, like, we can't lose the human in this whole part because it feels like even as you're talking about, like, the magic and the power of listening, it's like, I feel like, that connection. Like, I know when you and I step aside from this conversation, I'm gonna be filled up in a way that I would never get from AI. I'm gonna be like, "Wow, that was such an interesting perspective. What a unique point of view." Like, we went back and forth. It's kinda like stone soup, where, we had stone conversation soup where somebody put the stone in and you're like, "Hey, I got potatoes," and you threw the potatoes in, and, then I threw in the carrots, and then we both ate the stew, and it's like, "Wow, this is amazing." You can't get that with a non-sentient being.
Exactly, exactly, and that's going back to Seer again, not to belabor the point, but AI interprets what we give it, but the evaluation piece can be questionable,
Right.
right? How does it evaluate in a way that's going to bring benefit to me? Even the interpretation stage can miss the mark.
Mhm.
And so you have to go back and try again and again and again.
Right.
And it's also, at least at this point, probably going to change is, does it go beyond reading the words? Is it detecting my voice tone? Now, there are programs that do that, which could be a great assist in like meeting analysis, but I think it's just a wild, wild west opportunity
Mhm.
to be able to say, I think there's some value here. I'm not going to just give everything over to it because that becomes an adaptive challenge, Betsy,
Mhm.
in itself. How can I optimize AI for my coaching and consulting journey?
Yeah, so that you have more space, more time to do that relationship building that you actually love. And maybe it's like it gets rid of all of the other tasks that you don't love. Like maybe you don't love, spending hours on an email, so let it do the email or you could spend more time, like one-on-one.
Exactly. Exactly.
So I want to take you in a
Yeah,
different direction if that's okay with you.
sure.
So I'm very excited that you are part of the Center for Courage and Renewal with Parker Palmer. And I know that there's people out there who may not be familiar with his work. His book on Let Your Life Speak was a massive guide for me when I left Disney to start my own consulting business. And what I really loved about the whole idea of what he said there is like listening, the importance of listening to he says, like listening to the voice of your vocation, and he's inspired me so much, like, the first step on my brand positioning process that I do with my clients is I have an initial phase where I say, like, the first phase is I call it listening to your life, and I have my clients do an inventory, on their past experience and on their life story and, like, their passions, like, I have them do all this, like, listening posts
Right.
on that, which I feel really passionate about it, but again, we're still in the role of listening. So I would love your perspective because you're part of this particular world, and I would just love to have more insight on, like, who are you listening to? Like, if you're listening to the call of your vocation, you know, eh, who are you who's talking to you? Like, whose voice are you trying to hear? And what are you listening for? Like, if you are gonna guide, like, my clients who are mid-career professionals who are looking for significance, not just success, like, they really want meaningful work, can you speak a little bit more of, like, how do they hear that who are they listening does my question make sense?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Yes. So the work of Parker Palmer is at an entirely different plane than what I was accustomed to around listening. I'm moving from the cognitive dimension to the spiritual dimension without religion specifically connecting to it. And so when I had my first experience with Parker Palmer was his book The Courage to Teach.
Hmm.
And The Courage to Teach can be boiled down into it's not what you teach or how you teach it, it's who is the person who's teaching evolving as a person. And that struck me. And as I started to learn more about this, I saw that there was like an open call, not an open call, but if people were drawn to the work, that it's possible to not be certified because there was a long process to be able to enter this family or community or space. But I felt that I needed more. And so I was able to, again, without having a lot of background and courage work, enter the space. And it goes really back to the first point about opening the door yourself, because they said, well, you need to have had at least 10 retreats under your belt before you can even be considered. I had one.
Mm.
And I wrote an impassioned letter and called the people that make the decisions. And after a while, they said, "Okay, we'll bring you in for a s- uh, pre. It's all about retreat, not workshop, not seminar. It's retreat, and it's totally countercultural. I mean, we're sitting in a circle. There's a candle in the middle. It's totally in a different dimension. But after going through the initial retreat, I came out of that and I said, Betsy, I don't know much about listening. After all these years, experiencing this retreat was a whole new experience for me. And it comes back to the who are we listening to? Who is the voice? The voice is that inner space within ourself that's in fact, it's all about listening to the voice within because that's the essence of all of this work is we come together to give space to one another in a very and it's rigid in terms of the disciplined work, but it's like a duck. All of that work is underneath as the duck is paddling across the calm lake. You wouldn't even know it, right? Until you lead a retreat and then you know it.
So it sounds like
But
that
it,
you're connecting it to his quote about, like, the soul being like a wild animal and it's shy and it hides, and you have to,
yes,
like, create a safe environment that it's like you're listening to the inner wisdom that's, like, maybe connected to your soul? Or is that what this is about?
exactly, exactly. And it's telling the truth slant. In other words, you come to the realization primarily through honest, inviting questions that are served up for you from others and the only purpose of them asking you is so that you can listen to your own voice. It's not about their curiosity about your story. Now, think about this in the coaching and consulting world. If I'm asking you honest, inviting questions for you to be able to listen to your own voice, that's exactly what you need.
Mhm.
You don't need, and one of the touchstones, as it's called, is no fixing, saving, advising, or correcting. That is out, which is contrary to what many coaches and consultants feel they get paid to do.
So, can you give me feedback on something I do in my branding approach? Because there's some things like when my clients are so after I have an interview with them, like, I got a feeling or a sense of, like, I have, like, one of my clients right now, like, he's like the I think he's, like, meant to be an executive coach for the introvert. You know, he has this, like, life story about introversion and overcoming introversion, and he's got this, like, really quiet demeanor about him, and it's like and he just got his PhD or his DBA, you know, and he has this whole research project on it. And then there's, like, this practical side of him that wants to go after corporate and, you know, help them just do executive coaching for their succession plans. And I asked him in our last coaching session, I'm like, "All right, we're gonna take a break, you know, of like, you go off and like process these 2 different directions, and I really want you to listen to see like which one's accurate. Like my senses, and I see you much more alive, it connects with your story. You know, am I stepping over or am I holding up a mirror? Like, am I being too advice? Because it was like, because he started going on this other path, and it's like, this just doesn't feel like it's just I'm not feeling like, energy-wise, like, I'm just this just doesn't feel like it's totally aligned, so it's like, am I being in the right space or am I stepping over and moving too much into advisory?
No, no, you're at the E stage of Seer. You're evaluating, and your response is, let's take a moment here for you to think about what really matters most to you.
Yeah,
And without that opportunity, that's the responding side of it, for you to be able to offer this to the person, they will continue to spin with not putting their focus where it really needs to be.
and maybe if he comes back
They
and says, "This is the other path," it's like, "Cool, that's great," you know, but it's like, at least we took the moment, like, we took that Viktor Frankl moment of, you know, like, let's just take a beat and really think this through, and I think sometimes with my process, people get annoyed is, like, they wanna go faster, but I'm like, "We just need to sit with this because this is your life story that we're this is your life work that that's at risk here, you know, why are we gonna get it wrong? Like, let's just take some moments to let this moment kind of marinate and see how it goes."
Yes, and that's where Frankl says it's freedom.
Mm,
That's where the freedom comes in, because you've become liberated with your choice.
love that. I wanna talk to you forever, but I know we can't. This has been so helpful. I would love for you to share a little bit more about your LinkedIn newsletter and how people can sign up for that. And I do know you have your Listening Pays book and you have like consulting and coaching programs. You have a whole bunch of things. So, can you share a little bit more about the things that you offer and how people can get a hold of all of these different resources and things that you have available?
Absolutely. Well, the LinkedIn newsletter is called The Listening Leader. I don't believe there's 2 of them, right? I think it's the only one. Easy to get to, and it's a weekly. I'm committed to it. The Listening Pays book is, really a condensation of the work on listening leadership in a parable. It's a leadership story. It's about a troubled sales director, gets into a jam because he's not listening to his team, not listening to his boss, not listening to himself, and he finds an unsuspecting sage, a car detailer who happens to be deaf. And that car detailer had a transformation in his life. He lost his hearing at age 3. At age 40, got a cochlear implant, could hear again, got confidence, went back to school, found his way to a listening course at Rollins College, and I spotlighted Alfred Marino in the book as the hero, or the consultant, if you will, that helps the troubled sales director, and he helps guide him using all of the foundation material that I've gathered.
Interesting. Okay, I'll definitely
Yeah.
look at that up, but, as it relates to your consulting or coaching, I think that you are in an interesting point in your journey because if you do have the LinkedIn newsletter and you also have, your books that are out there, it's like, how do you make all of those things kinda, like, serve in a way that, like, brings the right people to you? And then it sounds like the way you wanna engage people is at a much deeper level. Like, it sounds like it's a combination of somebody who is not just like, "How do I help improve my leadership?" But it seems like with the background in the with the, Parker Palmer work, there's a way that you bring all of those pieces together too. So, we could definitely talk about that offline. I would love to talk to you more about that. I have a million ideas, and I also would love to see you do a mentor program like what you did with me, like that just-in-time advice. If it wasn't for you and that just-in-time advice, I'll tell you where my career trajectory would have gone. I would have sat there in my little OD bubble with my OD language in the formal position as an OD consultant, but having no seat in the table. I would have been implementing like training workshops and I would have been doing like a lot of low level work. I would have never really been against those bigger projects. I never would have got to Disney. I would have never survived and thrived at Disney because of that. Like, I had a different perspective. I was, like, clearly outstanding from the beginning because I didn't wait for the leaders to invite me, to the table because of what I learned. I wouldn't have the business I have now. So, I would love to see other people have the opportunity. I mean, just in terms of I don't know, I could start crying again. Just the level of impact that you've had on me is tremendous and substantial.
Wow. Well, I'm so humbled, truly humbled. And I wished I could tell you that there was a master plan, but I believe there is, but it's beyond me.
Well, this has been a wonderful full circle moment. I highly, 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 beyond highly encourage you to check out. I know I'm supposed to call him Rick, but he's still Dr. Bommelje in some ways to me because, when I'm around him, like, okay, I'm still in my 20s, but I'm not, But I highly recommend checking out anything he is working on and done. Read his books. Definitely subscribe to that newsletter. I will be signing up for that newsletter immediately. And I think that this is so timely too in a world where we wanna keep our human connections in the middle of a world that doesn't feel like human connections is the priority to that level. So thank
You
you, thank
don't.
you so deeply much for being on the show.
Oh,
Forever
thank
deeply
you.
grateful.
You.
Okay, so you can obviously tell by how emotional I got and how much I gushed about the power of having not just a mentor, but the right one at the right time. So if I might be that one for you, like Dr. Rick was to me, I get to call him Rick now. Please head on over to my website at www.betsydordan.com to learn more about my programs. If you strongly suspect that we might be a fit, just go ahead and hit that big pink button at the top and request a discovery meeting now. So that's it for today's episode. If you enjoyed this episode, I would love for you to just hit subscribe wherever you're tuning in. Pass it on to your colleagues and friends. And I'd love it if you could take a minute and review it on Apple Podcasts because it really helps more people find the show. And I just really appreciate it. And until next time, thanks so much for listening.